this wonderful event, in part because my own public life began working with churches in poor communities in Chicago. And I think that for those of us who are interested in creating a better world, it requires a sense of purpose and a sense of faith, a belief that we can change things for the better, that we can treat people with kindness and tolerance, that we can bridge the differences that exist between nations and between religions, and that we are unified by a benevolent God. Now that I'm no longer president, but I'm still hopefully have a little bit of influence, that I'm going to be in a position to help more and more young people deal with some of these challenges, to encourage a new generation of leadership, so that we can marginalize those who would try to divide us and bring together more and more people who are trying to unite us around a common good. And I think this event is a great place to start. You never achieve 100% of what you want. That this is a human enterprise, and so inevitably it's flawed. And what you try to do is to work with others who share your values and share your vision to try to make things better, understanding that you won't make things perfect. If we can sustain that progress, then I feel very optimistic about our future. It's ultimately going to depend on the young people who are here today, and my job now is to help them take it the next step.
Sie haben jetzt
But now, as a president, I can do what I want.
Well, the Chancellor and I were talking briefly before. I think the international order is at a crossroads. It's an important time in the international community. If you think about what occurred, I was born in 1961, which I know that makes me seem very old to many of you. But in history, that's actually not a very long time. And when I was born, the United States was, countries were still emerging from colonialism. And because I think of a set of ideals and principles, rule of law, is that because of globalization and because of technology, and the disruptions that have occurred, the inequality that exists between nations and within countries, because of the fact that the internet brings us all closer together, but we're still from different cultures and sometimes feel disoriented by the world shrinking because of things like the refugee crisis, that this order that has been created has to be changed, it has to be updated, it has to be continually renewed, because there's a competing narrative, fear and xenophobia and nationalism and intolerance and anti-democratic trends. And so when I think about my role when I was president, but also now as a citizen of the United States and part of the world community, what I think is most important, we rally around those values and ideals that are best, and we have to push back against those trends that would violate human rights or that would suppress democracy or that would restrict individual freedoms of conscience and religion. And that is going to be a significant battle that we have to fight, all of us have to be a part of. And it's not always easy, because peace and prosperity. And as president, I did not always had the tools that I wanted to affect those kinds of changes, but at least we tried. And part of the goal here is if you try long enough, eventually what President Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, I think can win out.
Ja.
Even though the question wasn't directed at me, I just want to make one comment about this. Because the United States, although as a consequence of geography and separation from oceans, we haven't seen the same numbers of refugees from Syria or Afghanistan. There obviously has been a significant immigration debate in the United States, people coming from Mexico, more recently coming from Central America and Latin America. And the struggle that I think Angela has, that I've had when I was President of the United States, is that in the eyes of God, a child on the other side of the border is no less worthy of love and compassion than my own child. But we are also the heads of nation states. And we have responsibility. We make investments to try to deal with climate change and the displacement of farmers and people whose way of life is being changed because weather patterns are changing. In this new world that we live in, we can't isolate ourselves. We can't hide behind a wall. And the United States is a very religious country, and I think that's been a great source of strength. But part of the reason historically that we've been such a vibrant faith community is because there's been a separation between the state and the church. And that, by the way, was viewed as a protection of communities of faith, that they would be able to practice their religion freely. And it has served us well, I believe. I think that the issue is not whether there's too much religious motivation in people going into public service or being part of government. I think the danger is when we fail to recognize that in a democracy, there are going to be people of many different faiths, and that in democracy, compromise is something that's required. About our own religious faith, by definition, there are certain things we don't compromise. And I think where we get confused sometimes is bringing the same unwillingness to compromise that we may express in our own faith into the political process. Because the truth is that in the United States, we're a predominantly Christian nation, but we are also a Muslim nation and a Hindu nation and a Jewish nation and a nation that has a lot of non-believers. But what we is ethical and moral principles that bridge us together. And when we focus on those things, then we can make progress, even if in our own families, our own faith communities, our own religious practice, there are certain things that we're not going to agree with. And that, I think, is where we sometimes get confused. I will say, in my own faith, I also think that it's useful to have a little bit of doubt. Faith is... The reason you need faith is because you're believing in things that you can't see right away. And as a consequence, I'm always humble. I try to be humble when it comes to my faith. I don't assume that God is speaking exclusively through me. Assume that God sees wisdom in all the people out here too. And if I become so convinced that I'm always right, that it does not admit the possibility that maybe someone else has some wisdom and is expressing God's will, then the logical conclusion of that ends up oftentimes being great cruelty and great violence. And I think that in a pluralistic world, in a world in which we have many different peoples coming from many different faith traditions, trying to preserve some sense that each of us only sees part of the truth, not the whole truth, is an important quality to have. I think the challenge that we all face, and there's no perfect answer for this, we discover it through our actions and reflection, is, as Angela said, we're motivated by our faith, our conscience, the values and ideals that are most important to us. We should be willing to risk something for them. We should be willing to challenge conventional wisdom. If you think about the United States, it was people of faith who were the first ones to speak out against slavery. And it required a sense of righteous anger against an institution that for many they viewed as just the natural order of things. It was a radical movement initially that eventually elevated people's consciousnesses and led to that long march towards freedom. So we have to act based on what we believe is true and is right. My only suggestion is that when we do so, it is important for us also to remind ourselves that God does not speak to us alone. That if the actions we're taking appear to violate the freedoms, the dignity, a sense of mutual respect with others, if we fail to listen to people who disagree with us, if our faith is so weak that we can't have it challenged and we shut people off or lash out against them because somehow they don't agree exactly with what we agree with, then to some degree our faith isn't very strong. For me, the strength of your faith is that you can engage with people who have different views, and you can treat them with respect, and you can listen to them, and you can have a good argument and then still find ways to live together and work together. And hopefully, if your faith is strong enough and your ideas are strong enough and they meet the test of time, then ultimately, I believe in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. Sometimes it takes, as Angela said, a long time to get there. And the most important thing that faith provides is maybe persistence and a willingness to continue even when it's hard.
Darf ich es an einer Stelle?
Let me divide the question into two parts. I think that one of the major questions that this generation and future generations will have to face is the growing gap in opportunity and increasing inequality that we're seeing between nations and within nations. The amounts of wealth and opportunity and consumption that exists at the very top relative to the enormous need that still exists around the world is something that, in my view, is unconscionable. And there is enough to feed everyone. There is enough to shelter everyone and clothe everyone and educate everyone if we are able to design a social compact that reflects our best values. Now, that's not easy to do. I think that it's not simply a matter of writing a check and sending money, because part of the goal has to be to create societies that are self-sufficient and have self-determination and dignity. And this is why when I looked at how we could budget our development and our aid programs, we were constantly focused on not simply how do you give a fish, but how do you teach people to fish. And also, by the way, how do you make sure that governments are promoting the interests of the people from the bottom up as opposed to just folks at the top. And I think we should take a moment to reflect on the enormous progress that has been made, even in my lifetime. There have been hundreds of millions of people who have been lifted out of extreme poverty just over the last several decades. Hundreds of millions of people, China, in India, in parts of Africa that are some of the fastest growing in the world. We always focus on what still needs to be done, but sometimes in order to motivate ourselves, we have to look back and see the good things that have been accomplished and have been achieved. So that's point number one. The second point is with respect to military budgets. Look, would I love to see, for example, the ultimate elimination of nuclear weapons from this planet? Absolutely. I spoke about that in Prague my first year as president. It should be seen as promoting education for girls in villages, because we know that countries where women are educated tend to do better economically, and as a consequence are less likely to get into conflicts. All those things have to be a part of what we view as our national security policy. And as Angela pointed out, some of the crisis that's happened with refugees is promoted as of economic interests of traffickers, and those have to be shut down. Trying to bridge the divides that currently exist between Shia and Sunni. We were talking earlier about the nature of religious faith. Here's an example where within a religion you have seen an unleashing of animosities that didn't necessarily exist historically, but that have been used on occasion cynically by leaders to promote their own interests. And we should also remind ourselves that this is not unique, by the way, to the Middle East or Islam, because on this continent, within the Christian religion, there was a whole lot of conflict for a very long time as well. This is part of our original sin, it appears, and because kids who don't have opportunity are more prone to get into trouble with the law, more prone to get involved with criminal activity, more prone to be vulnerable to extremist ideologies. They're not contributing to the tax base. The quality of life for everybody begins to decline. And so the good news is we know what to do. The bad news is that we haven't convinced everybody of the necessity of going ahead and doing it. And that's going to take some work. People operating in the shadows. And so what I tried to do throughout my presidency is create a legal structure and an architecture that would be consistent with our values, with the law, with our principles, with our humanity, but was also firm in terms of defeating those who would kill innocent people. And in some cases, I know for a fact that actions that I took might have resulted in civilian casualties, oftentimes as a consequence of error. But what I will also say is that we were able to put in place a system where there were safeguards in when. The one thing that I would say for those who are concerned about this issue is that when you look at drones versus other ways of fighting, it actually typically results in fewer civilian casualties and actually tends to be more precise in targeting than the average launching of a Tomahawk missile from a ship or the launching of a missile from a plane. So the drones themselves are not per se the problem. The problem is war, which is always tragic, always messy, and I think the danger of drones is not that they are inherently more violent than other weapons. What is dangerous about drones is that because you can be removed from the theater of war, leaders can become complacent, and they can start thinking that this is a something that's happening like a video game, as opposed to it involving real people on the ground. And that's something that within my administration I consistently try to fight against, to remind us that no matter how worthy our cause, that we have to do things in ways that do not degrade our own humanity. And that means recognizing that even when we're justified in taking a kinetic action and taking a shot at a terrorist organization, that this is still something that we have to carry with us. I would caution, though, people who are critics to remember, though, these are groups that would be willing to explode a bomb in this audience right now. And we shouldn't be too complacent in recognizing the need to fight against them. Hopefully, over time, it's a battle of ideas and not just a battle of weapons, so that we convince fewer and fewer younger people to get involved with organizations like ISIS. But as long as they're functioning out there, we are going to have to protect our people. I'd want to protect you and your classmates and my daughter and people around the world from senseless violence. And we just have to make sure we do it in a way that does not encourage more violence over the long term. The generation that's coming up, I think, is as smart, as sophisticated, as tolerant, as thoughtful as any generation that's come before it. The people who led the civil rights movement were your age and younger. It wasn't 50-year-olds. It wasn't 70-year-olds. Martin Luther King Jr. had not reached 40 before he was killed. Most of the work he did was in his late 20s and early 30s. Of course, Jesus Christ, was here just for a short period of time, but transformed the world. Entrepreneur, or you want to be a pastor, or whatever it is you want to do with your career, getting involved and being engaged is going to be critical for us to solve the problems of today. And being cynical and saying, politicians are all corrupt and institutions are all corrupt and there's nothing I can do. If that's your attitude, then yes, things will get worse. But it'll get worse because you did not make the commitment to live out the values and the things that you believe in. One of the things that I'm going to be focusing on is my presidential center and foundation. And that's really going to be, I think, my focus over the next several years, trying to create a network so that we can train the next generation of leaders, and that I can help young people like this who are already doing amazing things to get to know each other across countries, within countries, to give them the skills and the tools so that they can make even more changes in the future. I am very optimistic, and the reason I'm most optimistic is because of remarkable young people like this and young people in the audience who are already making the world a better place. My job is to see if I can be a good coach to them so that they can be the next groundbreakers who transform this place into what I think God intended, a place of peace and prosperity, and a place where all our children have opportunity. In addition to that, I have to continue being a good husband to Michelle. And that's a full-time job.
Ja.
Thank you very much.